It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this joint MICD Mechanical Engineering Seminar. And it's also my pleasure to welcome Emma Lejeune. Emma is a recently joined assistant professor at Boston University. She's also among a crop of exciting new junior researchers in the field of computational mechanics. Emma got her PhD at Stanford in working with Christian Linder, and then did a postdoc for about a year at University of Texas at Austin, working with Michael Sachs, and then moved to BU. Her work is already recognized. She's received a number of internal awards from Boston University, as well as the ASME Applied Mechanics Division's Haythorne Twit Award for young faculty. It's a bit of a tongue twister, that one. But most importantly, Emma's work draws from mechanics, from computation, and also increasingly from data-driven modeling. The focus of her work is to try and understand how, as we generate more and more data from computations, we can both use these data to learn more about the complex systems that she studies, as well as to use data to enhance them. And applications-wise, her mechanics work draws from biomechanics as well as other problems in applied mechanics. So without dragging it on much more, welcome, Emma, and we're really looking forward to hearing all that you have to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Krishna, and thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be virtually here giving this talk. So I'll just jump in and get started. As Krishna mentioned, I started at Boston University in January 2020, so it's been kind of an interesting year. But I wanted to start this talk with a picture of my group. This is our first group picture, obviously over Zoom, with grad students Bill, Jeffrey, and Hiba, who have all been involved in this work a little bit. And then also, more importantly, they're all kind of working on projects that are sort of the more exciting next steps of some of this initial stuff that I'm going to touch on. And as you can probably tell from the sort of general title of my talk, I'm going to stitch together a couple of topics in this presentation. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to be focusing on computational methods for modeling spatially heterogeneous materials. Specifically, I'm going to discuss some of the recent work that we've been doing on constructing machine learning-based metamodels of heterogeneous material deformation. And then in the second part of my talk, I'm going to change gears and present kind of briefly some of the work we've been doing towards analyzing movies of beating human-induced stem cell-derived cardiomyocytes, which are in kind of a very abstract sense also a spatially heterogeneous biological material. And I'll say just kind of briefly that in the medium term, I have plans to kind of bring together these two areas of sort of purely computational modeling in the first topic, and then purely experimental data analysis in the second topic. But for now, these two examples are kind of separate worlds, so just sort of a heads up on that. So in my work, I'm really interested in simulating biological materials, especially biological tissue. And one of the challenges in doing this is that biological and bio-inspired materials as well are very spatially heterogeneous. We can see some examples of that on this slide. And just sort of very broadly speaking, modeling heterogeneous materials is challenging in part because of the massive input parameter space and then the uncertainty surrounding it. So for a certain block of material, there are just so many potential different material property configurations that are possible. And so to really kind of get like a true range of the possible behavior for a given system, we really need to run multiple simulations. And this can be really limiting when a single simulation takes a long time to run and the input parameter space is so big that we would really need several thousands of simulations to actually explore it. So this brings us to the idea of metamodels, or models of models, that are constructed by training a machine learning model on a database of simulation results. And this practice will allow us to take model inputs, so in this example, material property distributions, that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and then use the machine learning-based metamodel to predict fixed quantities of interest at essentially what ends up being a fraction of the computational cost of running a whole finite element simulation. And these are becoming kind of more and more popular as sort of a tool that people use in their research. And they really end up being sort of essential almost at this point when you really want to do things that require a high number of simulation results. And just on this slide are a few kind of cool examples from the recent literature. I should probably even update this slide to get more 2020 and 2021 papers. But there have been a lot of really nice examples in using these for multi-scale modeling, material design optimization, uncertainty quantification and sensitivity analysis, real-time prediction, data integration, and much, much more. But one thing that I've kind of really been thinking about, and I think a lot of other people have kind of been thinking about this topic too, especially in the computational mechanics research community, is that despite all this recent work, there really isn't a clear picture of what types or architectures of metamodels will work best on engineering mechanics relevant data. And I mean, the answer is probably that there are a bunch of models that will work, best in a certain situation. But there still isn't necessarily a clear picture even for certain subsets of engineering mechanics relevant data. And really, to solve a given problem, there are just so many different types of models to choose from. And then within each model, there are so many different choices of model architecture and potential different hyperparameters that it's hard to kind of compare between different papers or different aspects of the literature. And one thing that you notice if you look at other fields, specifically computer vision, is that a way to overcome this is to start thinking about benchmark data sets. And benchmark data sets have really had a massive impact in both showcasing new methods and then also motivating really future research directions. And two of the most popular examples are shown here. So ImageNet, which is a collection of labeled images, and MNIST, which is a collection of labeled handwritten digits. And just notably, kind of the barrier to entry for working with these data sets is super low. As shown on the slide, you can download MNIST in 2 lines of code. If you've never worked with it before, you could have it on your laptop before I move on to the next slide pretty much. And these data sets just make it pretty easy to compare different machine learning models through their benchmark performance. And so what I'm going to talk about in this talk is kind of some of my early attempts at creating something similar for the mechanics community. And specifically, I'm going to introduce a benchmark data set that I've created and sort of provide a snapshot of a part of the work that we've done with it so far. And I'll say that this is kind of very much ongoing work, but I'll show you sort of where we're up to at this point. So this is the mechanical MNIST dataset. It's a simple dataset for regression problems in mechanics. And in this dataset, we are directly inspired by the original MNIST dataset of handwritten digits. And just as kind of an aside, the original MNIST dataset is popular. It's very well known. But another thing that's convenient about it is that it's a super nice size. So it's small enough to download on pretty much any modern computer with a standard Wi-Fi connection, but it's also large enough to meaningfully train a neural network to make predictions on it. And here what we do in creating this data set is we convert the 70,000 images in MNIST to 70,000 simulations of a neo-Hookean material with varying modulus, where the digit is basically a high modulus material embedded in a low modulus matrix. And then we run simulations where we deform the block of material. And you can see some examples here. These are examples of the uniaxial extension case. And you can see how the stiff kind of digit influences the way the entire domain deforms. And then for each 28 by 28 input bitmap, we report full field displacements, total change in strain energy, and then total reaction force at multiple steps of applied displacement. And we conduct all of our simulations with the open source library Phoenix, and our code is freely available on GitHub if anyone's interested. And I'll also share the link to this data set at the end of the talk. And in addition to what I showed on the previous slide, the mechanical MNIST dataset also contains multiple different load cases. So uniaxial extension, shear, equibiaxial extension, and confined compression. We also have the fashion MNIST pattern, which is a little bit more challenging to work with than the original MNIST pattern, which is fairly consistent over the whole data set. And then also we've recently added multiple different simulation fidelity levels. And in this talk, we'll focus mostly on the uniaxial extension load case for the MNIST pattern of digits. Specifically, we'll focus on the meta model where we predict change in strain energy at the end of the simulation from the original input bitmap. But we'll also further validate our results on the fashion MNIST dataset, and we'll draw from the different simulation fidelity levels shown here in part of the talk. So sort of first and foremost, we can train a convolutional neural network to predict strain energy at a fixed applied displacement from an initial input bitmap, just with a convolutional neural network similar to the one that's illustrated on this slide. And from this graph where we plot the mean absolute percent test error on the y-axis and then the number of training samples on the x-axis, you can see that we get pretty good performance when there are tens of thousands of available training examples. And with kind of more refinement of this neural network, we would get probably nearly perfect performance if we use the whole data set, which again is tens of thousands of training examples. Of course, when there are only, say, 100 or 1,000 training examples, the meta model performance is really not so great. And we are sort of in this red highlighted region where what we really want to be able to do is to add more training data. And the problem is that sort of for the actual applications that we're interested in with modeling spatially heterogeneous materials, we are actually usually in this area where we want more training data rather than this area of diminishing returns. And this is basically for sort of, at least I'm going to talk about two main reasons why this might be true here. So the first problem is essentially that the simulations themselves might be too computationally expensive to run tens of thousands of them. And problem number two, we might have limited access to these kind of input bitmaps or spatially heterogeneous material property distributions. And so in the context of this toy problem, we might only have, say, 1,000 handwritten digit examples to use as simulation inputs. And what we can do basically is see how we can leverage just 1,000 examples from the data set. And so in the next two sections of my talk, or sort of the next sort of two subsections of my talk, I guess, I'm going to address methods to overcome these two problems. So the first thing that I mentioned is the case where generating training data might be prohibitively expensive. So in our toy problem with Mechanical MNIST, we are able to generate enough simulations to reach this point of diminishing returns. But in the real world, our best case scenario really might only be around 1,000 simulations. And this is especially the case if each simulation is something like what's pictured here. And it's also really very much the case if each simulation is going to require some degree of human intervention to ensure that it's correct or something hasn't gone awry, even if it just takes a second to open up the results and say that it looks good. 1,000 simulations conducted that way might be tractable, whereas 10,000 probably wouldn't be. So the question is, can we leverage low fidelity data sets to make predictions with our meta models, in particular convolutional neural networks, and essentially move further down this curve on this sort of dotted blue line without running additional full fidelity simulations, but beyond our original 100 or 1,000. So I'll just say briefly, there's been a lot of recent work in this direction. You often see the term kind of multi-fidelity modeling in the literature. Here I'm going to use the broader term transfer learning, which describes basically the practice of leveraging the knowledge gained while solving one problem. So in this case, solving the low fidelity simulation to solve a different but related problem, in this case, a high fidelity simulation. And on this slide is an example of what that might mean in the context of problems in computational mechanics. So if we have a toy problem where we're simulating the deflection of a heterogeneous beam, a low fidelity simulation might have linear elements and an unrefined mesh. So that's sort of a known poor choice, right? Whereas a high fidelity simulation might have a more expensive but more accurate element, and of course have a fully refined mesh. And the idea is that with transfer learning, we can pre-train our meta model using the low fidelity data and then subsequently get better performance after transfer to the high fidelity data set with fewer or relatively few new training points required. So for our Mechanical MNIST data set, here is what different simulation fidelities actually look like. So on the upper row, we have our high fidelity simulations, so with fully refined meshes, quadratic elements, and we also incorporated a 3D example. On the lower row, we have meshes of various coarseness with linear elements, and then simulations where the applied displacement is just a perturbation, so a tiny fraction of a percentage of the displacement in our full fidelity simulations. And you can see simulation times range from basically fractions of a second for our perturbation simulations on the relatively coarse meshes to tens of minutes or so for our 3D simulations. And these simulations are all conducted in Phoenix, so it's not necessarily the fastest finite element code, but it's important to note basically that these high fidelity simulations are a couple orders of magnitude more expensive to run, or an order of magnitude more expensive to run than the low fidelity simulations. So on this slide, we basically show a schematic for how we will conduct transfer learning. And I'll say briefly that this is just a very sort of simple, straightforward form of transfer learning. There are a lot of other ways to potentially approach this problem. But essentially what we're looking at is model pre-training, where we simply train our meta model on one data set and then use that as a starting point for further training on the actual data set that we care about. And as you can see in PyTorch, this can be implemented in one line of code. It's pretty straightforward to implement. But the thing that's nice is that despite being straightforward, it's a very effective technique. So here we use our coarse mesh perturbation simulations to pre-train the model. And then we perform additional training with our high fidelity data set. And this plot shows basically the test error on the y-axis and the number of high fidelity simulations used for training on the x-axis. And then the black upper curve shows the model, what the model performance would look like with no pre-training. And each one of these other curves shows a different number of low fidelity samples used for pre-training. And you can see that the point, at least with the point that's circled in blue right here, where we have just 100 high fidelity simulations, we can achieve comparable test error to the meta model that's trained with 60,000 full fidelity simulations. And this is kind of cool because in this case, even though this is a simple toy problem, running 60,000 high fidelity simulations will definitely require some sort of supercomputer or access to a workstation, whereas the combination of 60,000 low fidelity simulations with 100 high fidelity simulations is something that you could hypothetically generate overnight on your laptop. So with this approach, it's just much easier to generate the training data that you need to really properly train a convolutional neural network. And we can show that these results hold up with the fashion MNIST dataset. So in this case, the full fidelity best case scenario gives us 2.8% test error, whereas the transfer learning based approach gives us 3.6% test error. And you can see basically that it's a substantial improvement from the black curve here. And again, it's much cheaper to generate these data sets with the transfer learning approach by orders of magnitude. And just sort of some slight intuition, kind of, this is a little bit hand wavy, but for why this practice is so effective, we can use guided backpropagation to essentially visualize what the convolutional layers of the neural network are seeing when they look at an input pattern. So in the upper row, we show a meta model trained with 100 points, and then a meta model that's trained with 60,000 points. And then on the lower row, we show a meta model that's pre-trained with 60,000 low fidelity data points and then transferred to the high fidelity data set. And we can see that qualitatively, all the models trained with the higher number of data points are much more similar than the example with just 100 data points. So the pre-training process basically just helps all of the parameters of the model access this more optimal form. And on this slide, we show just another two samples where we transfer between load cases from our multi-fidelity mechanical MNIST part of our data set. So on the left, we go from a uniaxial extension to equibiaxial extension. And you can see that in this case, transfer learning is a little bit less effective than some of the previous examples that we've shown, but the model pre-training still gives essentially these simulations or these meta models a boost. And then we also show a highly effective example where we go from the perturbation simulations to the 3D simulations. So here, the circled blue dot, the meta model is trained with just 100 high fidelity simulations and 60,000 low fidelity simulations. And it's performing just as well as the meta model that's trained with the 60,000 full fidelity simulations, which is pretty nice, given that in this case, the low fidelity simulations are dramatically cheaper. And then on this slide, we have sort of the actual data from these same examples. So equibiaxial extension versus uniaxial extension. These are basically just comparing how similar the output quantities of interest are in these data sets. And then the 3D extension and twist with the 2D perturbation. And we basically see that for the more effective case of transfer learning, the data is much more correlated, which is not really necessarily surprising. And to get transfer learning to work, all that really needs to happen is to get a neural network to learn sort of the relationship between the two data sets, which can be much simpler than basically learning how an input bitmap will affect an output quantity of interest. And then sort of zooming back out to the big picture of this, to overcome the problem that I mentioned to kind of introduce why I've been doing this, that running tens of thousands of simulations is unrealistic. We can use transfer learning where we pre-train with correlated low fidelity simulations to address this. And just something that I've kind of been thinking about recently is sort of this ideological challenge of deciding what the correlated low fidelity simulations actually should be. And the nice thing about this machine learning approach is that we have a massive amount of flexibility and sort of room to be creative here about sort of the design of effective correlated but computationally cheap simulations. And again, sort of overall, this is potentially a realistic approach to generating enough training data to meaningfully train these neural networks and convolutional neural networks. So that's sort of the first problem that I mentioned. The second problem that I mentioned, I've kind of reiterated on this slide. So even if we can now leverage low fidelity data, we might not actually have enough examples of the heterogeneous pattern that we're actually interested in to do this. I think probably anyone who's kind of an experimentalist on the line can speak to this. In the real world best case scenario, we might have fewer than, or even maybe sometimes way fewer than about 1,000 input patterns to look at. So here's an example of what it might look like to somehow get sort of 1,000 input parameters from a histology data set. And then sort of the question is, how could we hypothetically access this lower part of the curve if we only have a limited number of examples of what the input pattern might actually look like? So sort of a naive first approach would be to just kind of randomly generate input patterns by shuffling the pixels of the input distribution. So essentially just in an uncorrelated manner, choosing a pixel brightness at each location from the example image probability distribution. And I tried this kind of just to see what would happen. And you can see that it might sort of artificially lower the test error at the start, where the test error is computed exclusively on the real patterns, not on any of the augmented patterns. But as we add a significant number of these randomly shuffled patterns, the performance of the model actually degrades. You can see in the dashed red line, the performance of the model is degrading. And if we open up our model and actually visualize a projection of one of the final fully connected layers using UMAP, which is just a projection method where the higher dimensional data is visualized in 2D, we can see that the model is actually separating out the real data from the generated data. So it's effectively learning the difference between the two data types when it's making predictions. And this approach, or at least I couldn't get this approach to work. So our second option that we can look at is a little bit more sophisticated. We can use a generative model or a model that generates new instances of data. So in this case, new input bitmaps to create example patterns. And specifically, we can use a variational autoencoder, which is shown here, where a network is basically trained so the input data can be encoded into a lower dimensional latent space that can then be used to approximately recreate the original input pattern by passing through a decoder network. And once this encoder-decoder network is trained, we can draw random samples from the latent space and then run them through the decoder network to generate more data. And this is just an example of what like a 5-dimensional latent space trained on the MNIST input pattern might look like. The points here are just plotting the latent space. And the samples here basically show what happens when we generate samples trained with 100, 1,000, and then 60,000 points when we train the variational autoencoder. And really, this is kind of cool because even in the case where our variational autoencoder isn't perfect, augmenting the training data by running these patterns through finite element simulations might actually help. And sort of just for fun, I've included an example of what doing this with kind of like a cooler, maybe more relevant pattern might look like, but I'll kind of skip through this in the interest of time. Okay, so here, what I actually do is I try training a convolutional network with a mixture of the real and then the autoencoder generated samples. And sort of disappointingly, it completely doesn't work. Again, the test error is even worse than the random patterns. And when we open up our convolutional neural network and look inside, you can see that there really isn't great integration between the real and generated points. The real points are sort of concentrated in the latent space. And the model is, again, kind of learning the difference between these data sets. And it kind of took maybe a while to sort of think about how to improve on this. But one of the criticisms of autoencoders is they tend to produce somewhat blurry patterns. And if we are treating sort of the kind of like brightness of these images as stiffness, then that's potentially a really big issue, right? It'll definitely influence the outcomes of our mechanical simulations. So one thing that we can do is we can create basically just a sharpening filter that essentially just adjusts the brightness of the generated data so that it matches the same probability distribution as the input bitmap samples. And basically you could sort of see examples of what it looks like to kind of sharpen these images or input property bitmaps. And then finally, if we do this, when we run this through our model, the augmented data actually starts to help. And there's definitely some room sort of for improvement here. But in this case, the augmented data meaningfully decreases test error. And then when we open up the convolutional neural network and visualize the latent space with UMAP, we see a much nicer integration between the two. And looking at sort of the latent space with UMAP is, again, like a little bit hand wavy, but it's nice to see sort of a confirmation that there's maybe basically the generated data is actually strengthening the model. And all of this is done with a low fidelity data set. So all of this generated data is created with low fidelity simulations. And then when the augmented low fidelity data set is subsequently transferred to the high fidelity data set with 1,000 examples, we get a 2% test error, which is better than where we were when we were in the region of diminishing returns. And this trend also holds up with the Fashion MNIST dataset. You can see that just from looking at these two slides that the latent spaces of these two models looks quite different. But one thing that's kind of cool is that with the Fashion MNIST dataset, when we transfer to the high fidelity dataset, we actually get lucky and beat the performance of the original transfer learning approach. And this is all done without sort of tuning any hyperparameters or changing the model anyway between the two datasets. And then sort of finally, this slide is very much more of an aside. There are probably a lot of different generative modeling approaches that could work to do this. Variational autoencoders are just one of them. In a very preliminary way, we've tried out using GANs or generative adversarial networks to augment our data set, kind of just out of curiosity. But so far, there's basically two problems. The first problem, as you can see here, really a higher number of training points is required to get anything that looks like a digit. Here, even at 10,000 points, these images don't look so good. At 1,000 data points, you can barely see it, but it's kind of like a messy cloud. And then even when we tried using data generated from our GAN trained with 60,000 data points, it actually had a similar effect to the random pattern where it made our model performance worse. And this is kind of ongoing, but just sort of an aside on that. And so just sort of to conclude the first part of our talk, even though we can effectively train convolutional neural networks on our toy dataset just fine, we anticipate two real-world problems preventing the broader adoption of these convolutional neural network-based metamodels. So first, the high computational cost of generating enough training data, and then second, limited information about the range of potential input material property distributions. And by combining transfer learning and generative models, we can make progress essentially in this direction. And this QR code will link to the dataset. And I really welcome anyone who wants to sort of give this or related problems a try to go ahead. And if you do, I would, of course, be curious about it. And we're also working on sort of a bunch of additions to this dataset to make it more sort of broadly meaningful and take on more challenging problems. And then the second part of my talk is much faster. But before I move on to it, I just want to advertise the two other benchmark datasets that we've been working on. The first, Buckley Instability Classification, or BIC, contains heterogeneous columns subject to a fixed level of applied displacement and classified as either stable or unstable. So just an example of a classification problem that's relevant to mechanics. And then the second is the RV Mechanics Experimental Dataset with data collected by my colleague at UT Austin, so Manuel Rausch's lab, where the results of histology and three-dimensional mechanical tests are given. So this is really a great resource for anyone who's interested in validating data-driven constitutive models of soft tissue. And I'll say sort of briefly that Manuel has collected some really high quality experimental data, but it also has a lot of real limitations that exclusively finite element analysis generated data sets won't have. And sort of figuring out clever ways to interface with those limitations is a cool problem all by itself. And I'm happy to circle back to either of these later, but I'll sort of shift gears completely to topic 2. And then I have another like 10 minutes about-ish, maybe 12 minutes. Okay. So topic 2, shifting gears quite a bit, as I sort of warned at the beginning of the talk. Here's another project that I'm excited about that we're currently working on. And just as a brief background, here we're a really small part of a much larger project, where the larger project is CELMET, which is an NSF ERC that's based at BU, but actually has a large contingent at the University of Michigan. And the big picture focus of CELMET is illustrated in this graphic. So essentially the focus is on advancing cardiovascular tissue engineering, basically by pushing the state of the art in nanobiomanufacturing, a little bit of a mouthful. But you can sort of see an example of what that might look like with this graphic here, where it's kind of trying to focus on the next generation of cardiovascular tissue engineering. And as a part of CELMET, there is a focus on human-induced pluripotent stem cell-derived cardiomyocytes. And just as background for people who might not be familiar, these are cells that can be taken from patients in a very minimally invasive manner, like from the blood or the skin, reprogrammed into stem cells, differentiated into cardiomyocytes, and then subsequently used for a lot of different applications, ranging from drug discovery to disease modeling to tissue engineering. And it's interesting because this is sort of a real opportunity to make decisions or create technology in a patient-specific manner. But one challenge associated with that is that these cells are difficult to characterize, so it can be difficult to extract meaningful information from these studies. And if we think about morphology specifically, if you look at these examples here, you can imagine that it might not be entirely straightforward to describe these cells, and the subcellular components of these cells might sort of appear or deform in kind of an inconsistent way. And in the bottom row of images on this slide, I sort of show what we're going to be focusing on, which is cells with fluorescently labeled sarcomere proteins, so in this case, fluorescently labeled Z-discs, which lets us see sort of the contractile units of these cells in action. So these white units will move closer together or farther apart as the sarcomere units contract and expand, like in the schematic diagram here. And just as like a little bit more sort of context, if we zoom into one of the example images, you see that the myofibrils of the iPSCs are very nonlinear. And later when we look at the relevant movies, you'll be able to tell that the contraction can be quite asynchronous. And this contrasts pretty strongly with mature cardiomyocyte cells, which are known for having a very organized structure, like the example is illustrated here. And when functioning correctly, they also have a very synchronous contraction, which we won't necessarily see in these examples. So with that sort of as broader context, we've been working on creating software and methods to analyze movies of beating-induced pluripotent stem cell-derived cardiomyocytes with fluorescently labeled striations. And essentially, we've been looking at methods and code to segment, track, and analyze sarcomeres in these movies. And we've done this very much in collaboration with Chris Chen at BU and Kahan Singh from the Chen Lab, and with a lot of input and suggestions from others. And again, sort of coming back to this idea that we're a smaller part of the bigger project, I'll just say briefly that there's sort of a whole world involved in acquiring this experimental data that I'm not going to touch on in this talk, but it's very fascinating and very much non-trivial. So just sort of to begin, the first thing that we've looked at or tried to implement in our analysis pipeline is just figuring out methods for sarcomere segmentation and tracking that we were actually happy with. And in the interest of time, I won't go into too much detail on these other than to say I'm happy to talk about it if anyone's interested. But we've relied heavily on basically Python packages. One of our goals was kind of to have no manual input parameter tuning required. And we also invested a lot of time in generating synthetic data to validate our pipeline, which was an important step because we really didn't have ground truth labeled experimental data in really a meaningful way. And this slide is just an example of one of the validation studies that we ran. So in the images labeled 20, we're able to recover all 20 sarcomeres, which is most of the images shown until you get really bad distortions or really bad noise. So once we've done the segmentation and tracking step, we're kind of in a cool place because we have an interesting opportunity for computational discovery. And as you can see from these slides, these movies, even though they're they're just movies alone without anything necessarily supporting them, we can extract a lot of interesting things like overall structure, XY position of tracked sarcomeres. You can see that sometimes it's sort of they move around in a cyclic way. Sometimes it's a little bit more irregular. You can see in this bottom row, you have a time series of sarcomere shortening. So the x-axis in those plots is normalized sarcomere length, the y-axis is normalized sarcomere length, and the x-axis is time. And this sort of just leads to a lot of interesting opportunities for data analysis. And what I'll show next is just sort of two examples of what we've done so far with this. And there's a lot of interesting things that we haven't had time or we haven't really tried out just yet. So again, this is kind of the beginning. So first, the title of our code is actually SarcGraph, and that is because we've developed a method to link chains of sarcomeres and Z-disks. So essentially, we keep track of sarcomeres and Z-disks with unique identifiers during tracking, and then we can construct these spatial graphs where each Z-disk is a node and then each sarcomere is an edge. And then representing the data in this way has a lot of potential benefits that at this point we've kind of just barely begun exploring. But one thing we've looked at a little bit is using this as a framework for exploring spatial correlations. So for example, we can use this as a framework to quantify local versus global fiber alignment. That's actually how the spatial graph image on this slide is color-coded. And we can do things like look at the similarity of contractile behavior of individual sarcomeres. So in this plot, we have normalized cross-correlation between the sarcomere pairs on the y-axis with respect to network distance on the x-axis. And then looking forward, we can do things like study the correlations in contraction with respect to network distance versus Euclidean distance and sort of things along those lines. And then finally, sort of another thing that we've been working on is coming up with metrics to really describe cell function. So in the literature, there are a lot of examples of metrics to describe static images of these cells, but there aren't super many existing methods to describe the functional behavior that we really see in these types of movies. And one thing we've looked at is basically taking advantage of the fact that each tracked element, be it a sarcomere or a Z-disk, can be treated as a fiducial marker. And then if we define vectors connecting these fiducial markers, we can compute an approximate deformation gradient by solving this overdetermined system of equations. And I'll just note very briefly that we've done something similar in the past with quantifying the results of agent-based models. And this is also very much inspired by work computing mean deformation metrics for traction force microscopy experiments that was done in Christian Frink's lab around 2016 or so. And the idea really is that these sort of basic mechanics or kinematic principles can be a very convenient way to quantify these data. And then once we have an average deformation gradient defined over whatever domain we choose, so in this case, whole cells, we can manipulate it to summarize function in pretty convenient ways. And then I just have a couple examples of what that looks like, and then I'll finish, I think, only a couple minutes past 3:45. So this first example is a cell on a pattern substrate with highly aligned fibers. And one thing that I thought was kind of cool about this example is that we can really see this kind of auxetic behavior in the way this thing deforms. So basically it's pulling in on its sides quite a bit as it shortens, and it's only attached to the substrate on the end, so it can do this. The upper time series shows basically the principal stretches, and then that are computed from the average deformation gradient. And then the lower time series shows basically the normalized sarcomere length for each individual sarcomere that we can track. And I've definitely spent a long time just kind of staring at these movies, trying to see patterns in them. And this is just another example of a cell on a glass substrate where if you look at the movie all by itself, the motion is pretty subtle. But with this method, we can see that there's relatively poor overall synchrony and contraction. You almost see sort of like a wave watching the colors change. But overall, a small but consistent contractile signal does end up emerging. And in the upper plot, you can see that in this case, it's pretty isotropic deformation with slightly more contraction in the direction of fiber alignment. And that is all that I have on the topic for now, at least. So thank you very much for listening to both parts of the talk and bearing with me through an abrupt transition. I think I'm only 1 minute past 3:45.
Thanks very much, Emma. Great rapid tour through some of the things that you're thinking about. The floor is open for questions. You could, I think it's simplest to just unmute yourself and ask the question, but if you want to put it in the chat, I'll read it out too, but go ahead. Right, maybe I'll get things going here. Shares prerogative. So going back to the first part of the talk, you have, so first of all, I did indeed use the QR code and looked at mechanical MNIST, and I see there are a bunch of data sets there of all kinds. And but then what you focused on is essentially looking at these meta models, as you like refer to them, for mechanical behavior. And now, and there's transfer learning in the way you are sort of learning the model, but there's also transfer. There are other sort of approaches to transfer learning that are also open to you now, right? And I think you talked about, looking at different load cases, looking at uniaxial and biaxial loading. So one can go even beyond that. And I guess I wanted to understand how are you using these models now? They're essentially generating uniaxial, or you can also query them in biaxial load.
Yeah. So the data outputs have basically several distinct load cases. Right at this point in time, I haven't done anything like trying to create a model, a machine learning model that somehow you pass boundary conditions information to it. But I think you have a recent paper or preprint with Shoshan on that direction.
Yeah, and that's exactly, it's you got you know what I'm thinking about. So right. So the interest is to see, how well do those models, how well are they learning, not just different boundary conditions, but ultimately, can you also, I guess, these are CNN. So how would you think of applying them to completely different domains as well, right? So how far?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as a very sort of brute force approach would be to figure out some way to encode information about boundary conditions also in like a CNN format, maybe as another image or something like that, and have the model sort of learn that. But I would imagine that there are much sort of more sophisticated and better ways to go about making these meta models more universal and better at sort of quasi-learning mechanics. Because the convolutional neural networks that I've trained so far, at like as of I don't know, like today, I guess, are mostly looking at focusing on a single output quantity of interest.
Yeah.
And in that case, the convolutional neural network is just memorizing a relationship. There's truly, at least in my mind, no mechanics to it. I have a student right now who's been looking at predicting full field displacements. And I think that because that's a little bit more challenging, you inherently force the model to sort of learn more mechanics in a very brute force way. There's probably some way to integrate boundary conditions and full field displacements that would work really nicely.
Yeah, but you are thinking along those lines. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, I think full field displacements end up being a lot more interesting just because it's harder.
Other questions?
I've got one maybe. So
Sure.
you mentioned the mean deformation study, which I think when we originally had that, it was aimed towards motility. Do you see straightforward applications of prediction of, for example, motility from the the training sets here? Because that would have pretty major biological implications if we can connect. This is what's going on locally, and we're getting this kind of motion of a cell, lab on a chip kind of directions. Just want to comment on like directions forward towards like other areas of maybe biological problems here towards mechanics.
Yeah. I don't know super much about sort of motility in the context of this cell type, but I definitely think that sort of you generate a lot of kind of unstructured data from doing segmentation and tracking, and then the question is how can you kind of describe all of that data in a convenient way, and definitely like a motility metric or something like that I think would be interesting to think about as well. Yeah. And whether or not it's captured in the way that I've computed an average deformation gradient or not is something that I'm not sure about it at this point.
So do you see mechanical MNIST, if I can get back to that one, do you
Please.
see it, do you see it as essentially an open, completely open sort of platform, or I mean, it's open, but what I mean to say is, are you curating? Is there curation of the data in any particular way? Do you have do you have any checks on the kind of data being submitted there? Or,
yeah. So I mean, just logistic, like I would love if other people had sort of benchmark data that they felt would be broadly interesting and sort of started posting it online. I think the RV mechanics example is sort of an example of something like that, where it's a pretty unrelated project, but I think that sort of the spirit of it is really exciting. With regard to posting all of the things online in a specific format, I've definitely learned a lot in working with one of the librarians at BU who curates the data repository that I've worked with, the OpenBU institutional repository. For that institutional repository, they actually can't handle super big files, which is a little bit unfortunate. But I mean, it would be really interesting to think about what would be the best practices for dealing with truly large simulation data, and having sort of a standard for that. Like, that would be really interesting. Does that answer your question at all?
Well, so yeah, no, it does, and I guess I this is something I imagine that has to be sort of fleshed out and developed as you go forward with it. But I was just wondering whether you'd already started doing anything along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll say that the things that I've posted so far, my focus has been how can I store this data or post this data so that someone who's interested can be working with it as quickly as possible. So everything's kind of like in text files. They're sort of separated in a way that I thought was the most obvious. I think that for sort of more complicated kind of mechanics, very domain specific problems, you would want to look at a lot of sort of more sophisticated data compression strategies. And yeah, it's a whole world.
Other questions? Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, we thank Emma. Like I said before, interesting and important work, and it'll be very, very compelling to see how this evolves as it goes forward. I think we'll definitely be interested in getting involved with mechanical in this. So we'll hear more.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I definitely have been working on this stuff, hoping other people will use it. So if anyone wants to get in touch, I'm always available over email, even if you didn't want to ask a question.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. You know where to find Emma. You can see her email address up there, and she's offering to welcome all calls. So do not hesitate to get in touch.